Okay, for those of you guys that want to have me read the passage and you follow along, this is for you guys. This is not a requirement, but for those that prefer reading in that way, I wanted to provide this for you guys. So you should have this downloaded from today's lesson. It is all about Texas. So we're going to learn today how we acquired the state of Texas, how it became part of the United States. Chapter 18, this is actually from a different textbook that we are going to be using, but I think the reading is a little bit easier for you guys to comprehend. As we go through it, I am going to be an active reader, so I will be highlighting some things that I think are important. You guys can highlight as you go along. You don't have to. You can highlight different things than what I have. It's up to you guys. Okay, so the Lone Star non-state. So after Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, it became a republic with a government based in Mexico City. Its territory included present-day Texas, which the Spanish called Tejas. So I'm actually going to highlight, Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, and then I'm going to highlight its territory included present-day Texas. So that was a part of Mexico after 1821. So settlers in Texas. At the beginning of the 19th century, very few people lived in Tejas, or Texas, aside from a few thousand Tejanos, or Spanish Texans. To promote growth, the Mexican government offered large, inexpensive land grants to impresarios, or people who agreed to find settlers to purchase these grants. One of those settlers, one of those impresarios, was Stephen F. Austin, and he also received permission to start a new colony on the condition that the new settlers follow Mexican law. Austin agreed, and after arriving in Tejas in 1821, he recruited 300 new families who became known as the Old 300 to settle in the area. These families encouraged many more Americans to move to Tejas in the upcoming years. So in this section, I'm going to highlight a few things. So the first thing I'm going to highlight is that there were a few thousand people that lived in Tejas at this time, and they were called Tejanos. So I'm going to highlight very few people lived in Tejas, or Texas, aside from a few thousand Tejanos, or Spanish Texans. Okay. Then I'm also going to highlight to promote growth, so to get more people to move in to the land, the Mexican government offered large, inexpensive land grants to impresarios, people who agreed to find settlers to purchase these grants. So in order to get more people to move to Tejas, more than just the few thousand Tejanos, the Mexican government offered large land grants to people. So one of those impresarios was Stephen Austin, and he received permission to start a new colony on the condition that they follow Mexican law. So Stephen Austin was actually an American, and he received permission from the Mexican government to start a new colony in Tejas. And the only condition, or the only rule they had to follow, was that yes, they were Americans, but if they lived in Tejas, they had to follow Mexican law. So once they agreed to that, he recruited 300 families to move there. So that was the beginning of Americans in Tejas. So if we scroll down, it says the new American settlers did not speak Spanish or practice Catholicism, being Catholic, and they kept illegal slaves. Within a decade, there were more Americans in Texas than Tejanos, and the U.S. decided to pressure the Mexican government to sell its land. In 1830, fearful of the growing, dissatisfied American population in Texas, the Mexican government outlawed immigration from the U.S. to Texas. So we start to see problems with these American settlers that came to join Austin's colony. They started to have issues, and that's because They did not speak Spanish, and they did not practice Catholicism. They weren't Catholic, and they kept illegal slaves, which all three went against the Mexican rules or the Mexican laws. And remember, that's the only reason Mexico said they could come, is if they followed their laws. So these American settlers weren't doing that. So this is an issue. Now, within a decade, which is 10 years, there were more Americans in Texas than Tejanos. And so as a result, the U.S. decided to pressure the Mexican government to sell its land. So in 1830, fearful of the growing dissatisfied Americans, the Mexican government outlawed immigration from the U.S. to Texas. So instead of selling the land, the Mexican government said, actually, no more Americans are allowed to come. So Mexico said no more Americans are allowed to move to Texas. So the Texas War for Independence. So now you have really unhappy American settlers that already lived there prior to Mexico saying no, and now they are upset because they are being forced to follow laws they don't want to. So the Texas War for Independence. American Texans grew increasingly unhappy about following Mexican law. In 1833, Stephen Austin met with Mexico's vice president to urge or convince Mexico to lift the ban on immigration. They agreed, but did not agree to Austin's request that Texas become an independent Mexican state. Instead, Mexico's new president, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, arrested Austin in Saltillo and jailed him in Mexico City when he learned of Austin's plans for rebellion. President Santa Anna also declared himself a dictator, thereby violating and subsequently, or next, abolishing or getting rid of Mexico's constitution, which protected the Tejanos' rights. So the American Texans, those that settled there prior to Mexico cutting off immigration, they were unhappy about being forced to follow this law. So in 1833, Stephen Austin met with Mexico's vice president to urge or convince Mexico to lift the ban. Mexico agreed to lift the ban on immigration, so they said, okay, Americans can keep settling, but they did not agree to Stephen Austin's request, that Texas became an independent Mexican state. So they said, okay, you can have Americans come in, but you cannot be independent. So instead, Mexico's new president arrested Austin and jailed him because Austin was planning to rebel and try to fight for independence. Santa Anna also declared himself a dictator, which basically got rid of then Tejanos' rights. If he was a dictator, he didn't care about the government, and he took away their rights. So in 1835, Santa Anna gathered troops and sent them to Gonzales, Texas, with orders to seize its cannons there. The Mexicans failed to confiscate or take the weapon, but the attempt set off the first battle in the Texas War for Independence. So basically what we're going to highlight there is the first part in this war for Texas's independence. So in 1835, Santa Anna gathered troops and sent them to Gonzales, Texas. The attempt failed, but it set off the first battle. So now we have an upset group of American settlers in Texas, and now you have a dictator in Mexico trying to keep them from rebelling. And so now we're going to set off a battle in this war for Texas's independence. So the Alamo, you may or may not have heard about the Alamo. Some of you may have visited it in San Antonio, Texas. But it says the Alamo, having no army of their own, the Texans put out a call for volunteers. The 180-person volunteer militia, which included free African Americans, rebel Tejanos, remember Tejanos would be your Spanish-speaking Texans, local residents, and adventure-seeking Americans like Davy Crockett and James Bowie, occupied an abandoned mission called the Alamo from February 23rd to March 6, 1836. The volunteers were no match for Santa Anna, who had the entire Mexican military at his disposal. Mexican cannons broke down the walls of the Alamo, but the Texans did not surrender. The Mexicans captured and executed or killed the remaining militia, who were stationed at a fort called Goliad in the Goliad Massacre. But rather than become discouraged by these events, more Texans were inspired to join the militia. So we now have a battle at the Alamo. So the Texans had to call for volunteers. They had no one to help them fight the Mexican army. So they got their volunteer militia, their volunteer group, and that 180-person militia occupied an abandoned mission. A mission's kind of like a church-like structure, which is why this picture right here that you see above, it's kind of a drawing of basically this mission. It's a building. So they occupied an abandoned mission called the Alamo from February 23rd to March 6th, 1836. The volunteer militia were no match for Santa Anna, who had the entire Mexican military. So the Mexican cannons broke down the walls of the Alamo, but the Texans still did not surrender. So what happened was the Mexicans captured and executed the remaining militia, who were stationed at a fort right outside the Alamo. But even though they lost this battle at the Alamo, it actually inspired more Texans to join the militia and to continue to fight for their independence from Mexico. So the Battle of San Jacinto. As Santa Anna, remember President or dictator Santa Anna, remained on the attack, the Texas militia, now more than double in size and led by Sam Houston, headed eastward. On April 21st, 1836, Houston's troops ambushed Santa Anna's army at their camp near the San Jacinto River. Shouting, "Remember the Alamo!" the Texans quickly defeated the Mexicans, taking Santa Anna himself captive and forcing him to sign a treaty recognizing Texan independence. So the Texas militia, they wanted revenge for what happened at the Alamo. So the Texas militia, who now was more than 360 people, volunteers, and led by a man named Sam Houston, headed eastward. So they ambushed Santa Anna's army at their camp near the San Jacinto River. And that's where we get the phrase, "Remember the Alamo." That's what they shouted as they ambushed them. And the Texans quickly defeated the Mexicans, and they forced Santa Anna to sign a treaty recognizing their independence. So as a result, after the Battle of San Jacinto, Texas is now an independent state. Okay, so it's an independent state on their own. So the Lone Star Republic. So during the siege of the Alamo, Texan leaders met to draft or write their own constitution, which they modeled after the U.S. Constitution. On March 2nd, 1836, they declared their independence and established the Republic of Texas, or the Lone Star Republic. After Santa Anna signed the treaty, elections were held, and Sam Houston became president of Texas. Stephen Austin, whom the capital of Texas was later named for, became Secretary of State. So once they became independent, after they forced Santa Anna to recognize their independence, they drafted or wrote their own constitution. And on March 2nd, 1836, they declared their independence and basically created a Lone Star Republic. So they're essentially at this point an independent country. Sam Houston became president. Stephen Austin became their Secretary of State. So they're basically operating as an independent country after winning their independence from Mexico. Because the Republic of Texas was in debt, they owed money, and still in conflict, they still had issues with the Mexicans, Sam Houston requested that the U.S. annex And if you look at this green little box, it says annex means to attach or add on. So Sam Houston requested that the U.S. basically add Texas in 1836 so that it could apply for statehood. So they asked the United States, hey, take us on, take our land so that we can apply to be a state. At the time, Andrew Jackson was president of the United States, and he feared admitting another slave state to the Union, because remember, we're trying to balance our free and our slave states, and Texas would be a slave state, so he was afraid to add that. And he was also afraid of provoking Mexico or making them want to fight, so he denied Texas's request. Instead, he offered Texas diplomatic recognition as its own nation. So he basically said, instead of becoming a state, we'll recognize you as your own country. The next president, Martin Van Buren, inherited the Texas issue from Jackson. Annexation debates took place under the Van Buren administration. So during his presidency, Congress debated what to do with Texas. Mexico never recognized the new nation and forced Texas to create the Texas Rangers, a militia devoted to guarding the border. Texas would not be admitted to the Union, or the United States, until 1845. So if we go back up, so Houston, clicked the wrong thing, sorry guys. Houston requested the United States add Texas in 1836 so it could apply for statehood. Jackson was president, and he denied the request. Remember, he didn't want to add another slave state. He didn't want to make Mexico mad, so he said no. So Mexico never recognized the new nation, and it forced Texas to create the Texas Rangers. If you guys are a baseball fan, you may know the Texas Rangers as a Major League Baseball team. That's what they're named after. And eventually, Texas would not be admitted to the Union until 1845. So, I'm going to use a different color here. For 9 years, from 1836 till 1845, because 1836 was when they declared their independence from Mexico, and they didn't become a state until 1845, Texas was an independent country. So that is why, if you actually look up state mottos, Texas is called the Lone Star State, because they were alone as an independent country for 9 years. So now that you guys have read through this, I want you to use this reading to answer the questions on the worksheet and submit the worksheet when you are done.